Hello my friends, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. So today's video is one that I have been wanting to do for a little while. I actually have had on my mind so much recently. I'm just about romantasy books, about fantasy romance books. I love the subgenre. I admit that it's not perfect, and I feel like no one can really settle on what the definition of a romantasy is. And so you inevitably have people who are maybe coming in from the fantasy side who are looking for a fantasy with a little bit of romance, and then you have people coming in from the romance side who are looking for romance with a little bit of fantasy, and it seems like it's a really hard thing to find that perfect blend of fantasy and romance for everyone who wants to read this subgenre. Now, this has been on my mind so much lately because I feel like I have seen an unending string of videos, TikToks, threads talking about, is romantasy ruining the fantasy genre? What is the deal with romantasy? I haven't seen a good romantasy book this whole year. Romantasy sucks. And inevitably, when that conversation gets going, it trickles down, and who does that affect most? It's typically the younger women who are really, really enjoying this genre, and it feels very reminiscent of Twilight. And now look, no one is going to argue that Twilight is a literary masterpiece. Those of us who love it, me, I love Twilight. I was around when it was alive and kicking, and I thought it was the funnest thing ever. None of us are going to say that it is the next best literary masterpiece, but what did it do? It brought so many people into reading again. That is the book that jump-started so many people to start reading again. Very much like what we're seeing happen today with romantasy and some of the popular books that kind of kick-started this subgenre, like Sarah J. Maas books, Jennifer L. Armentrout books, and a host of others, right? So as someone who has been a lover of romance books from the time I was about 14 years old, I am a diehard supporter of the romance genre. It really pains me and angers me when I hear this type of conversation happening that is typically directed towards young women who enjoy romance in their books and who also want some fantasy into it, right? So this video did not intend to be in defense of romantasy, although I really, really wanted to do a video like that. I just felt like I couldn't organize my thoughts in time to do that. It kind of also is that, because what I want to say is there is no one definition of what a romantasy book is or should be. It needs to have a blend of fantasy and romance, and every individual reader who is drawn to the genre, who decides to pick it up for the first time, their own personal barometer is going to be different for what they're expecting in that book, right? And even my own has changed over time, whereas in the beginning, I wanted this exceptionally well-built fantasy world. I wanted it to have this really strong fantasy world, plot world setting. I still want those things. And I was less interested in the romance aspect of it because that's what I wanted at the time. Whereas now, I feel like as long as the author can make me feel like this has fantasy elements and the romance is strong, I tend to prefer that now more than ever. That being said, I think that's a large reason why I have been just reading straight adult fantasy, and that's scratching my itch for what I want in a fantasy book, but it's not giving me what I want in romance, and even if there is a romantic subplot, it is not fulfilling to me as a romance reader. I want a full romance. So when I come to romantasy, there are a few things that I am specifically looking for. I want to feel like this fantasy world, whether it's in an urban setting, a high fantasy setting, whatever, I want to feel like this could exist, like this could be real. And there are several ways that the author can convince me of that without having this fully detailed, very elaborate, and you get all of the explanation of how this world exists. We don't typically need that. They can show us, they can create a feeling of how this world could exist. We need to feel like it's believable. We need to feel like it's crucial to our character's romance and to the story overall. Another thing that is very high on my list of important things that will rate a book 5 stars for me is the romance itself. This is probably the most important thing. If the romance feels convincing, if the romance feels real, if it has the elements that I'm looking for in a romance in a fantasy setting, which typically includes a lot of longing, a slow burn romance, and something that is not really overly smutty. I typically don't want that. Now, I will say unequivocally that there are poor examples of fantasy romance out there, for sure. To me, right? That doesn't mean they're poor examples to somebody else, for someone who is looking for that type of a reading experience, right? So for me, I want a convincing fantasy world. I want the plot to be centered in the fantasy world, and I want it to be interconnected with the romance. I don't want the romance to stand on its own. It needs to be interwoven with the fantasy setting and the fantasy story. So I thought that I would go ahead and recommend to you or tell you what my top 5 Romantasy books that I have read this year are. You probably can guess them if you have been a viewer for any length of time, but we're going to go ahead and go over them again, just to let you know these are the books that I've read this year. I've read a lot of Romantasy, and these are the ones that have stood out to me. Initially, maybe they weren't a full 5-star read for me, but as I read other books in the genre, I kept thinking about these, and so they were for sure 5 stars. That's not to say at all that these books are perfect. They have plenty of flaws that I am very well aware of, but they were still what I was looking for. They scratched the itch I was looking for when it comes to Romantasy. So, the first book that I want to talk about is actually the first book that I read this year, which really, really stunned me and wowed me, and it is When the Moon Hatched. I read this very early on when it was very first published. I'm the type of reader that if I hear a lot of chatter about a book, whether that be positive or negative, it really does give me some expectations for the book that affects my reading experience. So if I see a book that I'm interested in, I try very hard to tune out what everybody else is saying about it before I pick up that book, and that's exactly what happened with this one. I read this very early on, right after it was published, and I absolutely loved it. I will say that this book obviously has its flaws. I'm not going to go into them really elaborately, but the writing style can be difficult to get used to. It leans towards the purple prose. I do feel like she really tried to create a beautiful writing style, and for that I really commend her, because I think too often in Romantasy, not enough care is given to the writing style or the prose itself. So even though I feel like she overshot the mark, this one still was excellent in my opinion. And excellent in a way that I feel like she definitely tried to create a feeling with her writing style. So When the Moon Hatched, you've probably heard about it if you've heard about Romantasy at all, but I found it to be absolutely beautiful and very compelling, and I was very invested in this fantasy world. I will say this is a very complex fantasy world and timeline, and I've heard a lot of people say that they really they finished the book and they still struggled to know what this book was about. So don't be afraid of that if you are going into it like that. I will say that I read this book physically, and I think that is probably the best way to read this. I have heard several people say that they really had a hard time keeping up with the audiobook version of this. So we basically follow our heroine of the story. She is an assassin. She is sent to go and basically kill people of this opposing empire. Early on in the story, something tragic happens to someone that she loves, and that sets her on a course of vengeance, but unfortunately she finds herself landed in prison, where she is going to be executed as a mark of their power. Now, while she is in prison, she meets our hero, who is the king of a distant land, King Kale. He is grieving and mourning, and he is on a journey to find shards of a moon, which is essentially a dragon that died and rose up into the sky as a moon, and then fell and was shattered. And he's hoping to find all of those shards of the moon to put this dragon back together that has passed away. So he sees our heroine in the prison, and he feels something about her. He feels like he knew her. He feels like there's something about her that speaks to his soul. There is some connection that he feels with her, and he doesn't know what it is. And for her part, our heroine is very much she's the type of heroine that is going to be sassy, is going to be snarky. You know, she's a very strong, independent heroine, and she's had a lot of trauma in her life, and so she's very hesitant to trust him right off the bat. They end up working together throughout the course of the book. They go through several trials and a long journey, and we end up getting parts of her backstory and his backstory in flashbacks of what happened to them in the past, and we see how they actually were connected. That was something that I really loved about this book. I loved seeing the flashbacks and the whole idea that maybe these two knew each other before and what that was. That added a bit of intrigue that kept me interested through the whole thing. I also was very, very interested in the whole concept of these dragons, how they died and went up into the sky as moons. It's not anything that I had ever read before, and I am generally a sucker for dragons, and I absolutely loved how these were depicted in here. I also really loved our romance. I loved seeing something like this where one of them, specifically the hero, recognizes her, remembers something about her, but she doesn't. And the whole time they're trying to find out or figure out how do they know each other, and is this his lost love? I found this book to be very romantic. I found it to be very creative and unique and very compelling, and I had a hard time putting this book down, and I absolutely loved it. And I will definitely be reading the next one. Okay, the next book that I want to talk about is The Glow of the Everflame. So this is the second book in the Kindred's Curse saga. I've read the first and second book in this series, and I have really enjoyed both of them. I think this is a very fast-paced, very fun, very engaging read that is easy to understand with this world building that isn't too difficult, but that does feel real, like this could be a fantasy world that existed that we could just walk into, and I really enjoyed it. So our heroine is the daughter of a healer, and her mother has suddenly gone missing. She worked in the castle. This is a world that was conquered or colonized by the gods, and now their world is ruled by the gods' children. So they're like demigods, they're half gods, half human. Humans in this world are considered to be very much like lesser than everybody else. They don't have a good life, they're living in poverty, they don't have very many opportunities to live a happy, good life like the demigods do. So our heroine is basically on a journey to figure out where her mother went, what happened to her, and she's kind of drawn into almost like a uprising of the rebels in this world to try and figure out if she wants to be part of trying to bring this demigod civilization down. There are quite a few twists and turns in here. There are some absolutely fabulous magical creatures that are wonderful, like not quite a dragon, not quite a griffin, but if you like magical animals or magical creatures in your fantasy romance, like, you would absolutely love this for sure. This also has a potential love interest who is a prince, who is sort of dark and broody and has a heart of gold that is very, very, very fabulous in here. The thing that I really loved about this the most was its pace, and it had a lot of questions, but they didn't keep you hanging for too long. This book did a really good job of presenting questions, giving you a little bit kernel of knowledge or insight, and kind of dragging you along the story in that way, so that it felt like you were getting just enough reveals while still having some questions that kept you interested and intrigued to keep turning pages. I also am very interested in this romance. I think it is a great setup. It is a very slow building one throughout the course of several books. Like, you don't get the fulfillment of this romance in one book at all. But I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to the continuation of the series. There is one complaint about this series, the one that I think it is that it's just, the books themselves are too long. They need to be cut down or cut into different books, because one of the reasons I haven't finished this series or continued on to book 3, I did start it, but I didn't finish it, is just because it's way too long. It's too long, and I think that it's probably overfilled with stuff that doesn't need to be in there. But all of that being said, this is still a very fun and engaging series, and it really is a standout in fantasy romance. And I do think that if you're looking for something that feels similar to ACOTAR, this is the closest that I have found that has similar feelings. Not the same, but the same type of immersive, similar reading experience here. Now, the next one that I want to talk about is House of Bane and Blood. So this is one that actually really surprised me because I hadn't really heard anything positive or negative about this book, which is, you know, my preference for going into a book for sure. But I wasn't entirely sure how I was going to feel about it, but I kept feeling drawn to it. This was pitched as Six of Crows meets Peaky Blinders, and I think that's exactly what this feels like. This is in like a post-industrial sort of steampunk type of setting where the people in this world have powers that are set into different type of castes, similar to how the Grishaverse is in Six of Crows. And in this book we have our heroine, who is basically the heiress of a railroad estate, railroad baron, and her family has come on some severe financial difficulties, and so she of course has to marry to try and get them out of their problems. Now, our hero, Nico, is a bit of a rogue. He's not exactly a stand-up dude, and of course that's why we love him, right? But he finds out that there's something about her family that could help a problem that he has, and so he offers to marry her and absolve all of her debt, and then he's going to use what he needs to with her family to meet his own ends. And so we sort of have this very complex dynamic with a lot of secrets kept between them in an arranged marriage. And while I do feel like this fantasy world could have been built a little bit better, it still gave me a great feeling of a fantasy setting and something that felt also urban in this time period. So that seemed like I was a little more forgiving of some of the fantasy elements that weren't necessarily fully well-established or well-developed. I really, really loved the romance in here. I loved our hero, who from the get-go was very taken with our heroine and really had eyes for her and thought that she was just beautiful. But I really loved watching this very hard man, who is basically like a crime lord, be very soft towards her. It's one of my favorite things in romances, and I absolutely loved it here. I also liked our heroine, who was very strong and had her own powers, and I just loved the romance specifically in here. The romance in here was exactly what I wanted it to be, and I think the fantasy setting in here gave it just enough like flavor to make it give me the feelings of what I want in a fantasy romance. So I loved this. I loved the characters. I thought this was fantastic, and I gave it 5 stars. Okay, so now this next one is a debut, and I was actually able to read an arc of this, and I was not sure how I was going to feel about this. I typically do not accept arcs from authors that are new to me, just because time is very limited, and I always worry that I'm not going to have enough time to get it read for this debut author who really needs the reviews, and also I worry that maybe this writing style isn't going to be for me. So I was very pleasantly surprised when I picked this up and saw that the writing was very strong, and that the story in and of itself was very strong as well. This is a pretty unique concept, even though it's set in the world that is a fae-centered world. The concept of this is basically we have an urban, realistic setting, and then we have the Fae world that is kind of like sort of hidden, but the humans know about it as well. And our heroine, her mother was telling her all about the Fae through her whole life, and basically to stay away from them at all costs. So our heroine one night finds herself drawn into the Fae world against her will, where she learns that she is basically the center of a prophecy regarding the Unseal Kingdom, which is going to bring it down and bring peace to the realm, essentially. So she is the red woman in this prophecy, and her Great Pyrenees dog is the white bear. So she ends up being kidnapped by the Unseal King, and he ends up being a very, very dangerous man, a very ruthless man, and a very bloodthirsty man, and even when it comes to her. But there is always something about him that sees something in her that is good, and that sort of draws out his better nature, and helps her to realize or to see that maybe the Unseal Kingdom isn't the villain that she thinks it is. So she kind of finds herself torn between the Sealy Kingdom and the Unseal Kingdom, and her feelings for the Unseal King continue to grow and grow the more they are together. And I just found this to be very refreshing, very beautifully written, and I just thought that the whole world and concept in here was very unique, and I liked the characters in here a lot. The romance in here, again, was the selling thing for me. I love this whole setup with the powerful Unseal King, you'll see this again in the next book, who, against his better judgment, finds himself completely drawn to this human girl, even though she's going to be the one who is supposed to bring down his kingdom. Like, I just love that so much. So this book is very underhyped. I don't feel like very many people at all have read it. It's brand new, it just came out, and I think that it is definitely worth your time if you want a unique take on a fae fantasy romance with an Unseal King and a human girl. Okay, now the last book that I want to talk about is The Wraith King by Juliet Cross. Juliet Cross is one of my favorite authors. I am such a huge fan of hers. I love her Stay a Spell series. I love her contemporary romances. I think that she has such a gift for creating great characters and great settings and great romances, and I just love her. I was able to beta read this book, so keep that in mind, but this is still my favorite fantasy romance that I have read this year. I think that the world in here is so beautifully fleshed out, and it's unique while not being like starkly different. It feels familiar, but it also feels like very creative enough that Juliet put her own unique spin on this and created something that feels like it is the Fae world. It has a little bit of Lord of the Rings vibes in there, but it also feels like something completely uniquely her own. So this romance in here is 100% my favorite thing, because we have our Wraith King hero who meets our heroine when they are both in the dungeon of actually the Wraith King at the time, who is the hero's father. And our hero is actually responsible for setting our heroine loose at the time. And she's part of the Light Fae and he is part of the Wraith Fae, and they are warring at this time. Now, when he set her free because he could not bear to see her perish in prison, he has never stopped thinking about her. So years pass, and opportunity is presented to him where he can overtake his father and become the Wraith King. And so he agrees and goes forth and does that. Now, at this time, he ends up going to the Light Fae's kingdom and offering them a bargain that if he is able to marry the girl who he met in the prisons, Princess Una, that they will not be war between their kingdoms anymore. So the Light Fae are very, very, very tempted by this because of the great losses that they have suffered at the hands of the Wraith Fae. So Princess Una, for her people, she agrees. Now, she doesn't know anything about this man other than she doesn't really like his people. They've killed a lot of her people. She's being forced against her will to go and marry him, so she's not exactly thrilled with that. He, on the other hand, is smitten with her and is longing for her and is pining for her for a very, very long time. And I just loved their romance. I thought it was so sweet. I thought this book was so freaking romantic. Of all the books that I'm talking about on here, this one is by far the most romantic, and that's why it is my favorite. But also, the fantasy world in here is so beautiful, it's so well developed, it's just such a stunning example of everything that I'm looking for in a fantasy romance. This book has it. So there you have it, my friends. Those are the best fantasy romances that I have read this year. Please let me know what your favorite fantasy romance is down below, and I will see y'all in my next video.